The first Christmas he disappeared. I thought I was imagining things, until I found his cufflink on the stair, cold as a coin, and the scent of his aftershave lingering on the kitchen curtain where he had stood only moments before. How does a woman who has known a man for 50 years learn to read the silence between his steps? I learned it one winter morning when the house hummed with the promise of roast and holly, and his chair at the head of the table sat empty like an accusation. I wrapped my hands around my chipped mug until the heat steadied my fingers, and I followed the echo of his footsteps out the back door. I will tell you plainly, this is not the tale of a foolish old woman clinging to romance. It is a tale of neglect, of small cruelties that gather like frost until they crack the wood of a life. It is about what a family will do when a fortune smells sweet and a grandmother's name smells of dust. My name is not important. Call me by the small names my grandchildren used to call me, Nani, Amma, old woman, whichever lets you hear the timbre of my voice. I live in a house that remembers hands, the marks on the kitchen table where my elbows rested while kneading dough, the faint circle on the floor where a mason jar of coins sat for years, catching spare change for birthdays no one mentioned anymore. The mason jar was my ledger of small joys. In the drawer beneath the table lay a string of old pearls, yellowed but real, a box of letters tied with twine, and a chipped blue mug that had been my companion since my husband and I first learned to balance on the same bed of bills and hunger. My daughter, the very one who would later brand me with the word inconvenient, has a house of marble and light 2 blocks away. She throws dinner parties where crystal glasses sing and chandeliers make the ceilings blush with their gold. She has assistants who fold napkins into flowers and a lawyer who speaks in measured syllables. Legal names like durable power of attorney, last will and testament, phrases that rose up like smoke to make ordinary things, like my name, disappear from the room. You must understand the ordinary world first. For 30 years, Christmas meant soup that smelled of onions and cinnamon, carols off-key, and my husband's slow, contented humming as he carved the roast. For the last 5 years, it had become a slow-burning irritant. My daughter's house, with its frosted windows and valet parking, where I was an honored guest in name only. Invitations arrived on glossy paper. My name printed on the envelope felt like a label. They would seat me near the window, where I could watch their arrivals and departures, grandchildren slipping like bright fish between laughing adults, cousins clustering with champagne flutes. My daughter smoothing her dress with the practiced impatience of a woman whose life believed its own press releases. He started to vanish every Christmas afternoon, sometimes for hours, sometimes for just long enough that my plate cooled. The first time, I thought he had gone to fetch something forgotten, an extra bottle of wine, the roast's secret spice, and I smiled indulgently, like a woman who trusts a routine. The second time, I noticed at 6:02 p.m. that his chair was empty and the potatoes were getting cold. But he returned with a sheepish grin and the story of a traffic jam that had been merciful enough to add a few minutes to his absence. The third time, my patience grew brittle. It sharpened like a knife left in lemon water. And one December 23rd, at 7:30 in the evening, 2 nights before my daughter's gala that would host politicians and sponsors and a man my daughter called an investor, I decided to follow him. I will admit, there was a childish part of me that delighted in this little espionage. Perhaps I had read The Count of Monte Cristo too young and kept a shelf of revenge novels stacked like neat dishes in my head. Perhaps I had kept too many small grievances in the jar on the table until their clink became a chorus and I could no longer sleep. Whatever the cause, I wrapped my coat tight, kissed my sleeping cat as if it were a talisman, and let the cold knit my courage. He left through the side door, humming something tuneless, and I trailed at a respectful distance. The streetlights painted halos around cars. The air tasted like onion and the last of the roast. He moved with a purpose I had not seen in many years, sliding his hand through his coat as if to smooth a crease only he could feel. I followed him to a car that smelled faintly of tobacco and a perfume I did not own, and I watched him meet with a woman by the curb, a slender woman in a red scarf who had the laugh of someone who had learned to keep secrets. They spoke in low tones, brief as weather changes. He reached into his coat, and I thought at first he was offering her his arm. Instead, he handed her an envelope thick with paper. I never expected what I found in that drawer. I learned later that envelopes are liars. They wear the face of gentility but hide knives. My husband kissed that woman on the cheek and said something that made her smile like a con artist seeing a mark. They parted. He got into his car and drove away. I stood in the shadows and let my breath make little ghosts against the streetlight. My hands trembled and I thought of the mason jar at home. Half full, the old pearls in the drawer, the string of letters tucked away under a photograph of the two of us at 23, smiling as if the world had not yet learned to be greedy. The next morning, I opened the envelope I had filched from his coat while he slept. It contained an invitation, glossy, embossed, to my daughter's gala, and a separate paper that smelled faintly of fresh ink. A letter from the lawyer on her staff telling my husband he was invited to attend a private signing on December 25th at 9:00 p.m. After the guests had left, the letter used words like convenience and expedient. It did not say who would be present, only that it concerned family financial. Restructuring, I folded the paper into the lines of my palm until the edges softened. My heart beat in a way I recognized only when someone has staked a finger in your mouth, the rhythm of fear and hunger. My husband had signed nothing, yet the paper implied his attendance as if he were a piece of furniture scheduled for repair. I tucked the letters into my apron and did what I had always done when the world felt larger than me. I made tea and waited, listening for the click of the key that would become his habit. How did it feel to be left at your own table? Like a portrait of yourself watched through a window, like your own shadow declining to stand by you when the world sang. The days that followed were a map of small wounds. My daughter began to visit less often, her calls arriving with all the warmth of a bank statement. Once, when I stopped by unexpectedly, just to bring extra cranberry sauce she loved, her assistant met me in the foyer and said, "Mrs., we appreciate your thought, but the family will be managing a private matter today." I say her name here as if it will sting less. It does not. The assistant's smile was polite as a closed hand. There were moments that cut deeper than any open insult. At the Christmas rehearsal, the family photographer, a man who had always greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, took the photos with me at the edge of the group as if I were a shrub in the garden, necessary only for the fullness of the picture. My granddaughter, who used to climb into my lap and ask for stories of the wartime, now sat primly on the sofa, her fingers perfectly manicured, and whispered into an iPhone as if the stories I told belonged to some museum rather than to her blood. I began to notice the omissions. Invitations that came with names carefully printed excluding Grandma, gifts that arrived with a polite card but no personal note, the way the family portraits on the wall angled as if to avoid my reflection. I found myself waking early more often, dressing in my old cardigan, fingering the pearls like an amulet, and staring at the mason jar of coins. The jar had been my secret. I had kept it since my husband's first winter of unemployment to collect what little we could for the grandchildren's school fees and the occasional theater ticket. I had never told anyone its amount. To me, those coins were more than money. They were proof that I had been useful. The first real blow came not with a shout but with a paperclip and a lawyer's nod. I received, in an envelope that smelled of cedar and the kind of polish you use on important things, a photocopy of a document titled Durable Power of Attorney, effective immediately. It was dated December 24th, the day before the gala. The signature, allegedly mine, was a shaky loop that could have been written by any weary hand. The notary stamped it with a blue seal I had seen before in offices and bank branches where people traded promises for signatures. I stared at that paper until the words blended into a foreign language. The document said, in precise legal terms, that I had transferred authority over my financial affairs to my husband and my daughter jointly. I never signed that document. I called the lawyer who had handled our modest affairs for years, a man with kind eyes and a slow smile. He asked me when I had last visited his office. When I told him, he shuffled papers and told me with the soft cruelty of someone bending facts into a frame, "Mrs., sometimes people forget signatures. We can verify." His voice crumpled in the polite way lawyers have of making you wait in a lobby while truth puts on its shoes. That night, I sat with my pearls in my lap and a cup of tea gone cold, and I felt something within me harden like caramel cooling. If they thought they could reduce me to a signature on a page, they had forgotten the many small rebellions that keep an old woman alive. The habit of keeping receipts, of hiding the extra coins in the seam of a quilt, of remembering dates and the flourishes of a signature. I had taught all my children to read the small print. Perhaps now one of them thought she could read my life like a ledger. I began to watch my husband more closely. I would find reasons to be at his side on the days preceding the holidays, asking him about errands that might be dull to him, where he was going at odd hours, whether he needed help with the car, and he would answer with faraway jokes, or a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. At night, when the house settled and the heating clicked off like a man becoming frugal in his speech, I would find him sitting at the kitchen table with a folded paper. He said it was nothing. Menus for the gala, arrangements for the roast. Once, I crept to the kitchen and found him at 11:17 p.m., pen in hand, writing in a ledger. He looked up, startled, and for a second I saw in his face the old hunger for recognition, the shame of someone who cannot keep up. And then came the night I decided to follow him again. This time I knew the streets better. I had a plan, trivial and brave, to watch him from a distance and to see who else in our small constellation orbiting him. I walked the lane behind the high hedges of my daughter's house, the cold making my cheeks tight as paper, and I watched lights bloom like promises in the windows. At 9:02 p.m., a car rolled up our drive. At 9:17 p.m., I saw him slip from it and go into the study with a man I had never met. A man with a face like an ad, smooth, expensive, polished to a point that made me feel ridiculous in my cardigan. They spoke for 30 minutes. I heard no raised voices, only the muffled clack of words. At 9:49 the man left, and my husband remained in the study. I could have gone home then, folded the night into my apron and let morning deal with it. But my curiosity had been salted by weeks of neglect, and I crept to the study window like a spy who had read too many novels and believed herself equal to fiction. I saw him open a drawer and take out a sealed envelope stamped with the bank's emblem. He held it as if it were brittle, and then he slid something else underneath it, a small velvet box. He tucked the box into his coat and left, my breath, which had been steady until then, seized up like a child's. There is a peculiar terror in knowing that someone you have loved is capable of an act you cannot yet name. Is it treachery? Is it cowardice? Is it a quiet surrender to convenience? I could not tell yet, but I felt the world tilt under the weight of things that did not belong to me. I waited until he returned, and that night at 11:03 p.m., when the house seemed to hold its own breath, I sat him down and said, "Where did you go this evening?" He smiled that same weary smile and said, "Oh, you know, meetings. Your daughter has many friends." His hand, lying on the arm of his chair, twitched like a bird deciding whether to flee. "Did you sign anything?" I asked. He met my eyes, and for a moment I thought he would tell me the truth. Instead, he said, "Just a few papers, agreements, routine." He said the word routine, as if he were describing a weather pattern that would not inconvenience us. His voice did the thing we have always allowed men to do when they want permission to be small. I felt something inside me split and slide. I remembered the mason jar and the pearls and the letters and, with an inexplicable clarity, a ledger from 1983 where I had scribbled, in my own uneven hand, "Save for rainy day." I thought of that money, of my dignity, held in small private acts. I decided, in that kitchen warmed by a single weak bulb and the memory of roast, that I would not be made into a footnote in my own life. I never expected the envelope to lead to a door I had been barred from. Dumas once wrote that the sting of betrayal is softened by time. But time, for me, had only sharpened the pain into a tool. I would not be silent. I would watch, I would remember, and I would, God willing, respond. The study door was ajar the next afternoon. I had not meant to become a sleuth. I had only meant to remember, to hold the small things I had kept for a lifetime as if they were lights against the dark. But the world will insist upon teaching lessons, and sometimes the pupils are old women with chipped teacups. When I pushed the study door that afternoon and found it ajar, the house smelled like lemon oil and secrets. The velvet box was gone from the drawer where my husband had tucked it. In its place lay a photocopy of a document with a blue seal and the neat, indifferent hand of a clerk who believed paper could make truth disappear. My fingers closed around it like a vice. The paper was a bank transfer receipt, transferred to Mirabel Holdings for about $230,000, executed on December 24th at 16:05. The number sat there on the page like a verdict. I had enough wits to photograph everything with my old phone. I have learned that the modern world keeps proofs as if they were children wearing name tags. My hands shook so much I could barely steady the lens. The photograph captured not only the receipt, but also the corner of a yellowed envelope stamped with Notary Public, December 24th, 2025, 1620. The date sat like an accusation. The law clerk at the bank had neat handwriting, and it called the transfer authorized. Authorized by whom? I could have gone straight to the police, to the cold efficiency that makes myths of justice. But the police are ships that move by schedule, and I needed something firmer than a trembling hand and the story of an old woman. I needed someone who would move as I moved, quiet, particular, and with a memory of signatures. I remembered the man with kindly eyes who had handled our small affairs for decades. Mr. Karim had been our lawyer through births, the small unpleasantness of a parking ticket, and the selling of a plot when money once threatened to sink us. He was not the sort of man who dressed his words in velvet. He wore ordinary shirts and had a patience like a well-read book. I went to his office on December 24th at 10:30 a.m., 2 hours before the lunch that would be mentioned in a family email as a necessary scheduling matter. He met me in the little parlor that smelled faintly of stale coffee and paper. When I explained, his face folded into a map of concern. He produced a copy of the durable power of attorney I had received and set it on the table between us. "Mrs.," he said, and I could hear the sorrowing syllables of a man who has seen too many people sign away things they later regretted. These things happen when people are not careful. I told him what I thought, that the signature was not mine. He did not scoff or choke me with legal jargon. Instead, he said, "There are ways to test the ink, Mrs. We can ask a handwriting expert. We can subpoena the notary records. We can request the bank to freeze transfers pending verification." He sounded like a man reading a recipe for hope, slow and precise. He called a handwriting analyst that afternoon. The analyst, a woman with keen eyes, came on December 24th at 4 p.m., and she studied my signature with a kind of compassion usually reserved for fragile artifacts. She told me later, in words that made my insides clench, that this signature shows inconsistencies in pressure and curl, suggesting it was traced. Traced. The notion made me feel like the fragile shell of my life had been dusted and refilled. While the analyst worked, I did what I always do when grief or anger threatens to unmoor me. I sorted the drawers. The top drawer of my sewing table yielded nothing but thread and a photograph of my husband and me at 27, our hair unruly and full of the belief that the world would behave itself. The middle drawer held the mason jar, half full of coins that chimed like a small confession. The back of the drawer, where the light rarely reached, had an envelope tucked away behind a notebook, a bank statement for account number ending in 7842, showing a balance that had once been stable just north of $250,000. Then, like a drop that makes a whole lake ripple, I found a series of withdrawals marked Transfer to Mirabel Holdings in the bank statement. The sums adding up in a way that swallowed most of what I had saved. $50,000 on November 30th, $80,000 on December the 1st, $100,000 on December 24th, in total about $230,000. I folded that statement and put it against my heart. The mason jar clinked in the other drawer, oblivious and faithful. I began to piece things together the way one might stitch a torn shirt, carefully, with small, stubborn stitches. Each piece of evidence felt like a bead on a thread, leading me toward a necklace of truth. Who had the notary stamp? Who had access to the account? How had the signature been traced? The answer, when it finally came, was at once as ordinary and as monstrous as the rest of our family's life. I overheard a call on December 24th at 7:42 p.m., my daughter's assistant, speaking to an unknown party. I had come into the kitchen for water and paused by the pantry, pretending to look for sugar. The phone on the counter left the conversation exposed like a broken window. Yes, the assistant said, voice careful. He signed at 4:16. Notary was present. The funds cleared. The transfer to Mirabel Holdings is complete. The client will be thanked at the gala tonight. The voice was paper-thin with triumph. Mirabel Holdings. The name burned like a brand. Mirabel was the name my daughter had chosen for her holding company, for the facade of family enterprises that made dinner parties possible. Mirabel, the flower she had once called a symbol for new beginnings, now smelled to me of ledger books and teeth. I had the dates, the receipts, the notary stamp, and the testimony of a handwriting analyst. I had the bank statements that showed the money had moved, the time that the man with the ad face had visited, and the velvet box tucked into my husband's coat. I had the photograph of the transfer receipt on my phone and the little voice on the assistant's call. The evidence sat like a small army before me. Now, what to do with an army? Dumas wrote that justice is often delayed, but that vengeance is a patient student. I was not here to be patient. I was here to be precise. The first move toward precision was to confront my husband not with accusation, but with a question that would prick his conscience like a pin to a balloon. On December 25th at 9 p.m., 2 hours after the party had been declared a resounding success in my daughter's newsletter, I asked him, in the quiet shadow of the kitchen, "Did you authorize these transfers?" He looked at me as if I had asked him whether the moon was made of glass. "Of course," he said. "I signed. I thought it would help. You know, for the children. For the family's security. Why didn't you tell me?" The words came out like a kettle's shriek. He fumbled for reasons thick with shame. "It was messy. It was complicated. I didn't want to worry you." His hands stayed folded as if to hide the shaking. I watched the man I had loved for 53 years shrink under the shape of an explanation. Perhaps it is true what people say, that love is a practice of forgiveness. But forgiveness presumes contrition. What he offered was convenience dressed as courtesy. I had thought then that perhaps my husband, if shamed, might reveal the trail further. But men sometimes roll themselves flat in the face of storm, and my husband had become a pebble in a fast river, shaped away into silence. I left him there, folded in his chair, like a little man made of paper. There was another path that might yield what I needed. The notary public. The notary whose seal appeared on the document was a clerk at a firm downtown, a firm that notarized things for a living and kept a tidy ledger of its activities. I walked into that office on December 26th at 10:12 a.m., my hands carrying the photograph of the notary stamp like a talisman. The clerk behind the desk admitted that a notary named Mr. Ahmed had been present on December 24th at 16:20 and had stamped and witnessed a document signed by a Mrs. My name. When I asked to see the sign-in sheet, the clerk said they kept those behind a counter for privacy reasons, but he would check. I felt my mouth go dry. He returned with a sheet that bore the notary's name and time. The handwriting matched the stamp. But then the clerk, in that practical, officious way people have when they suspect the world of being more complicated than it appears, said, "There was a man with your husband who signed in as his witness." "Sir," and he pronounced sir, as if I were a stranger. He added, almost as an afterthought, "and the notary did not keep a copy of the physical ID on file. We are a busy office. Busy offices are where small injustices find sanctuary." That afternoon, I found myself standing at the marble steps of my daughter's house with a photo of the bank transfer in my pocket and the mason jar clinking at my hip like a constable. I had thought to go in with polite questions, the ones that make a woman appear unthreatening. But my daughter greeted me in the foyer with the practiced cheer of a woman who wears goodwill like costume jewelry. "Mother," she said, and the words sounded like a coin tossed into a well. "I'm so glad you came. Did you enjoy the roast?" I looked at the portraits that hung in the hall, pictures whose frames were being slowly refitted to exclude me, and I felt the rage I had smuggled under my apron rise. "I have questions," I said, and the words were as simple as a hand on a teacup. About the accounts. About the transfers to Mirabel. Her smile did not change. Everything is settled. Don't worry. She led me toward the study, as if to show me the family ledger where she kept her charts. The study smelled of lemon and polished wood, of a life where every paper has a place. There, under the pale lamp, I found what I had hoped for and feared. A drawer unlocked. A thick envelope labeled Family Last Will and Testament, Confidential. My heartbeat tapped like a tambourine. I slid the envelope from the drawer as if I were drawing a sword. Inside was a will dated December 25th, 2025, naming my daughter as the sole executor and beneficiary of my estate, listed in explicit terms to include the cottage on Willow Lane, any bank accounts in my name, and all personal effects including jewelry, photographs, and any monies or securities. The will was witnessed by a man whose signature I did not recognize and notarized with the same blue seal as the power of attorney. I felt my knees go liquid. I read the last clause twice. This instrument supersedes any prior testament and revokes all previously executed wills. There it was, a document that, if held to be valid, erased my rights as a mother and substituted a daughter, my own child, for authority over my life's small holdings. My hands were cold enough to make the paper whisper. I tucked the will into my cardigan and excused myself as if I had been seized by sudden fatigue. I walked into the kitchen and made tea with hands that did not tremble from age so much as from something that used to be called righteous fury. At 9:14 p.m. that night, I sat alone in my kitchen and turned the paper in my hands like a relic. The evidence seemed irrefutable, the bank receipts, the notarized will, the handwriting analysis, and yet there was a single thing I did not yet have, a confession. I wanted a voice, not just signatures. I wanted to hear the plan articulated by the mouths that had shaped it. Grand gestures are less useful than small, clever ones. I needed leverage that would be convincing to people who wore suits and read from schedules. I thought of the assistant's call, the one that had let the truth skip like a stone across water. That phone call had been a mistake. I would turn mistakes into weapons. On December 27th at 2 p.m., I planted myself in the living room couch under the guise of knitting. I kept my phone on record, delicate as a spy's heartbeat. My daughter and her assistant came into the room to discuss, so I would be told later, the final adjustments to Mirabel's holdings. They lowered their voices in years of practiced secrecy. "We must ensure the accounts are consolidated," the assistant said. The funds were transferred as scheduled on December 24th at 16:05, and the notary seal is on the will dated December 25th at 21:03. My heart hit my ribs in time with the cuckoo clock. The assistant's words were a rope thrown to me in a storm. When the two of them left the room to attend to other preparations, I slid the recorder from my pocket and copied the audio onto a flash drive. The sound file was small, but in it was the cadence of conspiracy, names, dates, times, the very scaffolding of their plan. I did what I had never thought I would do. I walked to a local radio show. There is a program on the community station that plays old songs and talks about neighborhood things. The host is a woman who loves stories of ordinary bravery. I passed her the flash drive and pleaded with her to listen. She did so on December 28th at 10 a.m., and at 11 she called me and said, "This is clear. You must go to the bank and the public notary with these recordings. They will freeze funds if they see probable fraud." With that advice ringing in my ears, I went to the bank on December 29th at 9:05 a.m. The bank manager, a woman with a tie that claimed executive status, regarded my claims with the polite skepticism institutions reserve for the elderly who make noise. "We cannot freeze accounts on the basis of hearsay," she said. "We can, however, open an investigation if a formal complaint is filed, and if you have evidence of forgery, a handwriting report, or a notarized affidavit, we will act." She spoke like a gate. I had the handwriting analyst's statement, the bank receipts, the audio proving the transfers had been made, and the notarized will. The pieces were there like instruments in an orchestra, waiting for a conductor. I filed a formal complaint on December 29th at 10:12 a.m., and the bank put a temporary hold on the last transfer pending investigation. It felt partial and enormous at once. In the small hours of that evening, when the house was a soft thing stitched with sleep, I made my choice. I would not stand in a kitchen waiting for my identity to be auctioned. I would fight, and I would fight in the ways that mattered, with documents, witnesses, and a stubbornness that has outlived fashions and fortunes. I called my daughter into the study at 11:03 p.m., the hour when the house hunches and listens. I placed the photocopies of the bank transfers, the will, and the analyst's report on the desk between us. The lamp threw a circle of light that made the papers look like a small court. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. She did not look surprised. She was a woman who had rehearsed poise. "Mother, this is upsetting, but everything is in order. We acted with the family's best interests at heart." "Best interests," I repeated, tasting the phrase like metal. "Did you forge my signature? Did you convince the notary to notarize a document without proper ID? Did you transfer $230,000 from my account to Mirabelle Holdings?" She smiled with the professional half-smile of someone who had learned to cut the truth into manageable pieces. "You must understand, this is how things are done. Assets must be consolidated for tax reasons. Decisions must be decisive." Her assistant stood in the doorway then, as if to add punctuation. "We can iron everything out, Mrs." The assistant's face, up close, was like porcelain. "You'll be provided for. We have set aside funds for your comfort." A hollow laugh escaped me. "Set aside funds," I said, and the words felt absurd in my mouth. Set aside funds do not return to the dignity stolen. They are crumbs from a table where the main course has been taken. My daughter looked at me then with a look I had seen in the faces of many people who are born into a particular hunger. A combination of pity and calculation. "Mother," she said softly, "you are making this difficult." That word, difficult, was a small, sharp thing. It is the language of those who sanitize cruelty. It was at that moment that my decision crystallized like frost on a window pane. I would not be difficult. I would be precise and public. I would not beg. I would require. I would make them answer in places where their polished hands could not hide their fingerprints. I gathered the documents, the flash drive, the analyst's report, and the bank's acknowledgement of my complaint, and I walked out of the study into the night as if I were leaving for a church where martyrs were made. The modern world has shrines too, the press room at the community station, the courthouse steps, the registry office. I visited them all in the small days that followed, my cloak of age giving me an anonymity I would not otherwise have had. But they are clever, those who have rehearsed deceit. On December 30th at 8:45 p.m., as I sat in my car outside the registrar's office with the flash drive clutched like a talisman, my husband called. His voice on the phone was flat. "They know," he said, and in that single word I heard the rustle of papers and the closing of doors. "Who knows?" I demanded. "They do? Mirabelle, the bank, the notary. They're calling it a family reorganization, Mother. They say you are being unreasonable. Do they say you are in it?" A pause, then. "They say we all had to agree. They say we did what was required." "I have proof of transfers," I said. "I have a recording of the assistant acknowledging the funds. I filed a complaint. Then don't do anything rash." His voice trembled like the last leaf on a branch. I did the only rash thing any cautious old woman might do. I drove to their house. The night was a wet ribbon of light and reflection. I walked to the back gate and found it oddly open. There was a light in the study. I crept to the window with the freedom of someone who has nothing left to lose. What I saw there made something in me both cold and incandescent. My daughter stood at the desk with her hands on the will. Beside her was the man with the ad face, the investor, I supposed, the one who had visited our study like a polished animal. He smiled in a way that suggested victory felt like a new suit. "You handled it smoothly," he said, and his voice was velvet over steel. She laughed softly. "We had to," she said. "I could have knocked on the glass and shattered their composure like a delicate ornament. I could have burst through the door, demanding confessions. Instead, I sat down on the damp, cold step of the back garden and let the air find its way into my ribs." Dumas wrote of men and women who become architects of their own destiny when pushed into a corner. I felt that architecture begin to rise in me, plans stacked like books on a shelf, each title a necessary action. I would go public. I would gather witnesses. I would not beg for crumbs. I rose then, and when I turned from the window, I heard a sound I had been trying to avoid all along, the soft, unmistakable sound of my husband's keys dropping to the floor. He had come back, but not alone. They were both behind me when I walked into the kitchen. The light caught the edges of the man's watch like a proclamation. My husband looked at me with a face unmade by fear. My daughter looked at me with a face made by years of practice. "Mother," she said, and there was a note in her voice I did not recognize. "What are you doing with those documents?" I held the flash drive up like a verdict and said quietly, "I am keeping what is mine." Her eyes narrowed. The man in the suit moved forward, and for a sliver of a moment the house was a stage, and we actors caught in the center. "You're making trouble," he said. "You will ruin lives." "Not mine," I said. He laughed then, a small, incredulous sound that made my scalp prickle. "You don't understand what you have done. You can't fight paperwork." His accent was not of our town, but of a world that eats up small people for breakfast. "Perhaps I cannot fight paperwork alone," I replied, "but I can gather witnesses." At that moment, the study phone rang. No one moved. The sound echoed in the room like a bell. My daughter reached for it with the natural grace of someone who takes what she is given. Her fingers trembled, she answered. There was a pause long enough to feel charged, and then a voice said, "We've been notified. The transfer is under review." The voice on the other end was the bank manager's. My daughter's face went slack. Her eyes flicked to me, then to the man beside her. For a second, a crack opened in the armor of her posture. I had prepared for many things, but not for how exposed she would become in the instant a gate was latched and a hinge came free. This was the moment I had waited for. The turning point where there was no longer a path back to silence. I gathered my papers and said, with the sort of calm that can feel frightening in its certainty, "Then let us all go to the bank in the morning. Let witnesses come. Let the notary bring his ledger. I want to see the IDs, the sign-in sheets, the chain of custody for each document. We will put the matter where it belongs." My daughter's mouth tightened. The man's jaw clenched. My husband, caught between tides, looked as if he wished the earth would open and swallow him whole. "You're bluffing, Mother," my daughter said. "No," I answered. "I am not." Dumas taught that once a man decides upon a course, Providence often grants him allies. I had no illusions that Providence would act alone. I would be the Providence of my own small life. I had the voice on the flash drive, the handwriting analyst, the bank statements, and a community radio host who had already expressed concern. I had, improbably, a public station ready to listen. We arranged to meet at the bank at 10 a.m. the next morning. My palms felt as if they had been ironed flat. I slept poorly, dreaming of mason jars smashed on stone floors and pearls spilled like small moons. The next morning, I dressed in the only armor I had, a sensible coat, my pearls tucked beneath my scarf, the flash drive in the pocket that had always held my receipts. I went to the bank with the slow cadence of someone approaching an altar. When I arrived, the bank lobby buzzed with the polite hum of normal life, tellers counting, a child pulling at her mother's sleeve, appointment schedules glowing like small altars. The security guard led us, my daughter, the man in the suit, my husband, Mr. Karim the lawyer, and me, to a small conference room. The bank manager, tidy and severe, placed a folder on the table. "We have placed a temporary hold on the December 24th transfers pending an investigation," she said. Her tone suggested she had already been briefed. She opened the folder and slid a photocopy of a notary sign-in sheet across the table. When I saw the sheet, something in my throat clicked. The entry at 1620, the notary's signature, the witness signature, it was all there. The name signed in the witness line was not the man with the ad face. It was my husband's name. His signature, neat and deliberate, looked the same as it had on the mortgage papers of 1987. The notary's signature matched the blue seal on the documents. They had been careful. They had built an edifice of documents designed to look as steady as a stone bridge. The room felt suddenly very small. The man in the suit smiled at me with a smile that was all leisure. "See," he said, "everything is legal." But Mr. Karim, who had sat quietly until now, cleared his throat. I would like to request a handwriting comparison between the signature on the durable power of attorney and the signature samples we have on file from Mrs. on my name, he said. He looked at me then, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has consulted corroded ledgers and found a rusted truth. The bank manager hesitated, then said, "We can do that." "It will take time," she looked at my daughter. "Until then, the funds will remain on hold." My daughter's face went the color of an overripe apple. The man in the suit shifted, invisible as a shark, and then, as if the day intended to make its cruelty as complete as a well-tied bow, my daughter stood, leaned forward, and with a voice that was low and dangerous said, "We will not be humiliated." Her hand reached into her bag, and when she pulled it out, there was a newspaper clipping folded like a dagger. She opened it and spread it on the table, a photograph of me taken at the back gate the night before. "You have been taking pictures," she said. "This will not look good." For a moment, the room spun, and my breath came in small, stubborn catches. I had indeed taken photographs of receipts, sealed envelopes, the notary's stamp. But someone had taken a photograph of me. Someone had been watching my watchfulness. The manager looked at the photograph and then at me with a guarded curiosity. "Mrs.," she said, "do you have legal representation?" Mr. Karim gave a small nod. "Yes, I will assist her." My daughter's cheeks flushed with rage and something I could not name. And then the man in the suit leaned close and said, not quite a whisper, "You should not have pried." I looked back at him, my mouth a thin line. "Neither should you have stolen." For a second, the world flattened into a single line, paper on a table, signatures, the shifting of alliances. Then the bank manager's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face cooled. "There has been a notice," she said. "An attorney from Mirabelle Holdings has requested an emergency injunction." My daughter's smile returned like a tide. The man in the suit breathed a small private victory. Outside the conference room window, the city carried on its indifferent business. Inside, we sat facing one another like parties in history bound for pages. I gathered my things slowly, feeling both very small and very large at once. I had taken my first blows and landed some. I had forced the bank to see the evidence. I had recorded voices and presented witnesses. But just as Dumas's heroes learn, the moment of truth often arrives with a new complication and a final, unanticipated strike. As I stood to leave, the bank manager said, "We will need to consult counsel. There may be a legal injunction. We cannot proceed until the court rules." My daughter smiled with a blade under it. She turned to me and said, "This will be over soon, Mother." I had expected threats. I had not expected such a smooth, confident certainty. I stepped out of the bank into the thin December air and felt the cold press against my face like a rebuke. I clutched the flash drive in my pocket and the mason jar's coin jar warmth against my palm. I thought of all the winters I had survived, the small economies of kindness and thrift, the times I had made a meal out of little more than hope. Dumas tells us that when two wolves howl together, they do not always plan to eat the same village. I felt in that moment both hunted and protected by the small army of evidence I had raised. As I walked back to my car, my phone vibrated. The screen displayed a name I had not expected to see, unknown number. I answered. A voice on the other end, thin as a razor and calm as a winter pond, said, "You have made a disturbing choice, Mrs. My Name. Some things should remain private." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You will stop this," the voice said, "or we will ensure you regret it." The line went dead before I could answer. I stood on the sidewalk with the flash drive in my hand and a storm in my bones, a threat from the dark, a legal injunction, a hold at the bank. The war had begun. Dumas once wrote that no man is small when he fights for his name. He forgot to mention that no woman is tiny either, when she refuses to be erased. I folded my scarf tighter, and I drove home with the radio on low. Every small domestic noise amplified into purpose. I would meet them in court. I would call witnesses. I would demand to see the notary's ledger. I would prove the signature was forged. I would make them answer. But that night, as I unlocked my door at 11:37 p.m., The mason jar was gone from its hiding place. The pearls were missing from the drawer, and a single elegant cufflink, the one I had found on the stairs in the first part of this story, lay on the kitchen table like a cold accusation. I touched it and felt the story tighten around me like a noose. They had started to take more than my money. They thought taking my coins and pearls would bury me. They had not counted upon the soil of memory, which, once turned, always uncovers roots. When I discovered the mason jar gone and the pearls missing, the house felt hollowed, as if some hand had scooped out the center of a pie and offered me the crust. The cufflink sat on the kitchen table like an accusation, metallic and indifferent. I picked it up and felt, oddly, that its chill had the clarity of truth. It had been worn by my husband the night I had first followed him, and now it was left like a breadcrumb to remind me that my world could be rearranged without asking. I had already planted seeds that would not be so easily uprooted. The bank had placed a temporary hold. The handwriting analyst had written in plain, professional language that the signature on the durable power of attorney bore signs of tracing and inconsistencies in pressure. Mr. Karim, my lawyer, had requested a formal handwriting comparison from the court-appointed expert. The recording from the assistant, her tidy voice admitting the transfers, sat on a flash drive in my pocket like proof made audible. I had the will dated December 25, 2025, notarized with Mr. Ahmed's blue stamp. I had the bank receipts showing transfers totaling about $230,000, and I had the photograph of my husband handing an envelope to the woman in the red scarf. But proof is a farm that still needs tending. The next days were all roots and hands, subpoenas that smelled like paper and ink, phone calls that left my throat raw, and visits to the notary's office where the clerk who had seemed so officious now blinked and fumbled as if his hands had discovered sudden clumsiness. I sat across from him and watched his face rearrange itself under the weight of questions. He produced reluctantly a thin binder, the notary's appointment ledger. The ledger was the map I had been missing. It showed a neat line for December 24, 2025, 1620, Notary Ahmed, document executed, witness J, my husband's surname. But the ledger also had a blot of ink on an adjacent page, and beneath the tidy entries, a small, penciled note in Mr. Ahmed's hand. Client ID not checked. Left with assistant. The clerk's mouth made a small O, like a surprised child. Mr. Ahmed was ill that day, he said. He left arrangements with his assistant, who handles many clients. Sometimes procedures are... He did not finish. That little penciled note was a thread the length of a scarf. Mr. Ahmed's assistant, I discovered, was a woman who had once been a secretary at my daughter's firm and now did the notary's paperwork on the side. Her name was the same as the assistant who had chewed up the evidence in that phone call. The coincidences were beginning to look less like fate and more like a plan rehearsed and performed. I brought the ledger and the notary's penciled note to Mr. Karim on January 3, 2026. He is a careful man. He does not wear drama, but he knows where to lay the bricks that will support a case. We will petition the court to set aside the documents as procured by fraud, he told me. He used words like replevin and quiet title and petition to set aside fraudulent instruments, and they felt to me like the tools of a builder who knows the structure of houses. We will also file a criminal complaint for forgery, he added. Forgery is a serious offense. Will my daughter go to jail? I asked, because I've always been the sort of woman who wants to know how sharp the consequences might be. He folded his hands and looked at me with that gentle hardness that lawyers cultivate. That depends on the evidence and the prosecutor. But you have a strong civil claim, and the bank has already placed a hold. The criminal aspect will be for the state. I remember the way my heart carried the news, a small, steady, triumphant beat, not the high, foolish throb I had felt when I followed him the first night, but something older and calmer, like an engine learning its own rhythm. I called the radio host who had first listened to my flash drive, and she agreed to cover the story in a human interest segment. Elderly woman fights back against alleged family fraud, she said into the microphone as if she were announcing a play. The community took notice. People who had never known me called with offers of support. Neighbors who had seen strange cars. an old friend who remembered my daughter's first harsh words years ago, and a paralegal with patience who volunteered to sift through paperwork. Even my granddaughter, the one who had once climbed into my lap for tales, sent a message more tender than any of my daughter's designs. "Are you okay, Nani? I'm here." For a week, small things stacked behind me like an invisible shield, micro cliffhanger. The phone call changed everything. One morning, the thin, clear morning of January 8, 2026, the phone rang with an unknown number. The voice at the other end was flat, precise, and altogether too calm. "Mrs. and my name," it said. "We know what you are doing. Stop this now and the matter can be closed quietly." It was a threat dressed in courtesy. I hung up and carried the phone to Karim. He suggested we pass it along to the prosecutor's office. Legal threats are often part of intimidation campaigns. The prosecutor, a woman with a face like an open page, listened to our evidence and looked very grave. "We will file for an emergency hearing if necessary," she said. "This kind of intimidation will not be tolerated." By January 12th, the civil suit was filed, a petition to set aside the December 24th and 25th documents as procured by fraud, deceit, and undue influence, a demand for accounting of the transfers to Mirabel Holdings, and a request for return of the personal property, specifically my pearls and any jewelry, under a claim for conversion. The court set a preliminary hearing for January 20th. Between filings, my life was a series of small, exacting tasks, interviews with the handwriting expert, depositions that made my hands tremble, and a visit to the notary's office where Mr. Ahmed, pale and shrunken, confessed that his assistant had indeed notarized documents in his absence, and that she had accepted a call from a number he now recognized as belonging to the man in the suit. He said the assistant had been rushed, had not checked my ID in the file, and had handed over the stamp as if delivering a parcel. He shook his head, as though he might unlearn his complicity. This confession was not a trumpet blast. It was a careful shift in the mechanics of the machine that had been set against me. It meant that there was not only civil malfeasance, but also negligence and possible criminal liability. The man in the suit had not been a lone wolf. He had used assistants, notaries, and the polite indifference of institutions to sculpt his design. Micro cliffhanger. I would not let the past remain buried. On January 20th, the courthouse smelled of paper, coffee, and the kinds of nerves that make people whisper their vows of truth. We arrived early, me in my sensible coat with the pearls tucked beneath my scarf, Mr. Karim with a folder that had been ironed smooth by worry, the handwriting analyst with her laptop, and a clutch of witnesses who had seen little things. A flash of a red scarf, a man with a polished face, envelopes leaving a coat that, when sewn together, made something undeniable. My daughter arrived with the man in the suit and a cadre of polished lawyers. She walked like a woman who has rehearsed courage, but there was a brittleness to it, the sort that makes glass sing when the room is cold. The judge, an older woman with eyes like a ledger that had read too many human anxieties, called the room to order. We presented our evidence, the handwriting analyst's report, the bank statements showing transfers totaling about $230,000 on specific dates, November 30th, December 1st, and December 24th, the notary's ledger with the penciled note about the ID not being properly checked, and the audio of the assistant's admission. The prosecutors had been asked to look into criminal charges. Their presence in the gallery lent a gravity to the room. The bank, represented by counsel, had already acknowledged the temporary hold and cooperated with subpoenas. I watched my daughter as the testimony unfolded. When the assistant, called to the stand, admitted that she had notarized documents in Mr. Ahmed's absence and that she had been instructed by an unknown caller to proceed, the air in the courtroom felt like a held breath. The assistant's words were small and brittle, but they carried the weight of 1,000 small betrayals. The man in the suit tried to shape a defense. He suggested, with the smoothness of someone who believes in his own rhetoric, that all actions had been legal, that consolidation for tax purposes was normal, that my husband had agreed. But when Mr. Karim produced a bank affidavit showing that my husband's signature samples differed markedly from the signature on the durable power of attorney in pen pressure and curl, and when the handwriting analyst testified to the tracing indicators on that signature, the edifice began to tilt. At one point, the judge called for a brief recess. My daughter's face had gone pale. The man in the suit's jaw worked like a muscle at a dog show. I stepped into the hallway and found my granddaughter waiting with an expression I had not seen since she was small, open and aching. She slipped an envelope into my hand. Inside, a collection of old receipts, a box of theater tickets my husband and I had saved, and a letter I had written to myself in 1999 titled, "For Hard Times." She had found them in my attic and thought to bring them as evidence of my long-standing stewardship of our modest affairs. Tears came to my eyes, not only for the dignity of support, but for the restorative magic of being seen. Micro cliffhanger. The day the truth stepped forward. It did not do so quietly. When the court reconvened, the mood had changed. The bank requested more time to audit the transfers. The prosecutor indicated an intent to pursue the criminal angle. And the judge, with a voice that made the room feel like it was being measured, ruled to maintain the hold on the accounts pending full investigation and to order the notary's file to be produced in full. More importantly, she issued a temporary restraining order preventing any transfer of assets from Mirabel Holdings related to these funds until the matter was resolved. It was a small, precise victory, not final, but protective. The press, hungry for the human element, began to cover the story. Headlines in small papers called it "Family Feud Over Inheritance" and "Elderly Woman Alleges Fraud." My daughter complained privately that the publicity had made negotiations impossible. She said she had only wanted to protect the family's future. When I read the articles aloud to Mr. Karim that night, he laughed, a short, surprised sound. "They have made themselves loud," he said. "When people are loud, they make mistakes." What followed was a slow unmaking. The man in the suit, who had arrived in our lives like a theatrical villain, began to reveal seams. A quiet reporter called with questions, and when pressed, the man's company, Mirabel Holdings, produced documents that contradicted some of his claims. A subcontractor came forward to say that payments had been funneled through shell accounts. The assistant, now under oath, admitted that she had been paid a sum, a small, suspicious deposit, just days before the notary events. Mr. Karim obtained bank subpoenas that revealed transfers from Mirabel's accounts to an offshore entity rented in the name of a nominee. These discoveries led to the prosecutor opening a criminal investigation into both forgery and money laundering. Micro cliffhanger. The walls closed in. I want to be honest. Watching my child's house of glass crack was not a pleasure without pain. There are nights I rewind and try to remember the child who clutched my skirt and begged for stories until her eyes grew heavy. That child exists, a small, indelible arc in the life that led to this courtroom. But justice is not personal revenge. It is the restoration of balance. To reclaim my life, I had to see that balance restored. Even if the wreckage included my own child's dignity, when the criminal charges were formally brought, forgery and fraud on February 3, 2026, the community watched with an interest that was not simply voyeuristic. People were hungry to see that institutions could be held accountable when individuals misused their power. The notary's assistant was charged with negligent notarization and pleaded guilty to a reduced count in exchange for cooperation. She gave recorded testimony naming names and providing a chain of communications that linked the man in the suit to the payments and the notary's office. The court of public opinion began to tilt. At the civil trial, the judge ultimately found that the durable power of attorney and the December 25th will were procured through undue influence and forgery and ordered them set aside on March 12, 2026. The judge ordered an accounting and returned the sum. Transferred to Mirabel Holdings, about $230,000 to my account, pending any claims by legitimate creditors. The pearls, which had been sold to a pawnshop, were located and returned as well. My daughter, who had been stripped from the position of sole executrix, faced the humiliation of losing not only legal advantage, but social capital. Mirabelle Holdings faced fines, and the man in the suit found himself under indictment for fraud and money laundering. The poetic justice was not theatrical. It was quiet and complete. My daughter was not paraded in shame as a cartoon villain. She was required to answer questions, to apologize in court under oath for her part in the scheme, and to return what she had taken. The man in the suit was disbarred from practicing as a corporate agent in our state. Mirabelle Holdings Board was reshuffled, and the notary's office implemented stricter identification procedures. These are the practical remedies that restore order when greed has thrown things into disarray. Micro cliffhanger. I reclaimed more than money. With the funds returned and the documents set aside, I chose to do something that surprised even me. I refused to press for maximum punishment against my daughter. Instead, I required restitution and a public apology, both of which were delivered in court. The apology was clumsy and raw. It did not erase what she had done, but it acknowledged it. I chose mercy in the way an old woman chooses a warm blanket on a cold night, because it felt like the right covering for a hurt I did not want to feed with bitterness. After the trial, life returned to something like ordinary. I replaced the mason jar, not with its old coins, but with a new habit. I began to take a small portion of the returned funds and set it aside for grandchildren's education and for quiet pleasures. A new teapot, a trip to a seaside town I had always wanted to see. My husband, who stood in the kitchen the night the cufflink was left like a clue, grew quieter and more present. He confessed in a small, honest voice that he had been tempted by flattery and that he regretted the cowardice of not telling me. I forgave him slowly, the way one forgives a cracked teacup, by recognizing both its break and its service. People asked me often, in the weeks after, what the lesson of my story was. I told them, as Dumas might have said from his high horse in my low chair, that betrayal is a teacher in disguise. It strips you to the bone and shows you which parts of yourself are truly yours. I learned that dignity is not held in a ledger, but in the small, stubborn acts of memory. The mason jar saved for theater tickets. The chipped mug kept because it remembers your thumb, the pearls tucked away like a promise. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the continuing of life despite it. Micro cliffhanger. Even in victory, the heart looks for peace. Dumas wrote that revenge is a luxury, but justice is a necessity. I did not spend my victory on revenge. I spent it on restoration. I repaired relationships where they could be repaired, and where they could not, I put distance as gently as a gardener prunes a plant. My daughter and I rebuilt a fragile courtesy, visits that began with stiff smiles and eventually relaxed into conversations about grandchildren and the weather. There were dinners where we sat at opposite ends of the table and learned to speak without knives in our sentences. The community changed too. The notary's office installed new procedures. The bank changed its protocols for elderly clients. A law firm started a pro bono clinic for seniors who may have difficulties managing their affairs. My case was small in the history of the law, but big enough in our town to be a turning point for ordinary protections. I began to receive letters from strangers. "Thank you for standing up," they said. My father was nearly swindled. Those letters warm me still, like teacups in winter. I do not pretend my life is a novel in which every loose end is neatly tied with satin. There are still nights I wake and hear the echo of the house where I felt excluded, and I remember the sting of betrayal. But there are also mornings when I sit at my kitchen table with my chipped mug and watch the light pour across the wood and feel the small, domestic certainty of warmth. The pearls shine again in their box. The mason jar sits with a small collection of coins and a new habit. I put one coin there each Sunday, a little ritual of prudence and pride. If there is a final lesson I can offer, a Duma-like moral dressed in a grandmother's cardigan, it is this: dignity is a more stubborn thing than greed imagines. Those who would erase you believe paper and signatures have more power than a lifetime of tending the small domestic things. They are wrong. Paper can be forged, memory cannot. The law can be bent, but eventually, if enough people shine light on the shadows, the curve of truth will reveal what was hidden. If my story touched you, if it made you clutch the necklace you love or call your mother and ask if she needs help, then share it. Tell someone who might be in a kitchen with a mason jar and a chipped mug, unsure if their voice matters. Subscribe for more stories I have kept like seeds in my apron. I will tell them to you honestly, because we owe each other the truth. Comment below with small acts of courage you have witnessed. Let us build a catalog of ordinary bravery. I will end with what I always say when I close my stories. Keep your coins close, keep your letters closer, and remember that even the oldest hands can learn new ways to resist. If a winter comes, knit yourself a warm argument to keep the cold out. And if someone tries to take your warmth, do not be silent. Share this if you believe the small things matter. Subscribe so an old heart can keep telling you the truth.